carried out of the eastern gate on a stretcher made of 2 pine poles and a moth-eaten blanket, Maren did not cry. She counted the stars instead, 14 visible through the smoke. The settlement behind her was already closing its gates, already pretending she had never existed, and the Alpha King's decree had been delivered in 4 words by a courier who would not meet her eyes. "You are nothing to me." That was it. No further sentence, no reason given. The courier folded the parchment back into his breast pocket and walked away, and Maren lay on the stretcher with her hands flat against her stomach and counted the stars and said nothing at all. What Theron did not know, what he had not bothered to ask, what had not occurred to him as worth asking, was whose child she carried. He assumed he knew. He was wrong, and that error, small and careless and contemptuous, would cost him more than he had yet lost in any war. Before the crown recovered from the scandal, there was the mud. Before the mud, there was the gate, and before the gate, there was Maren. 3 months earlier, the kingdom of Varenthold had smelled like iron and wet grain, and the particular cold that comes off mountain stone just before the first snow of autumn. Maren had arrived at the Blackfold compound on foot, which was already unusual. Tribute women came by cart, by escort, occasionally by reluctant family member on horseback. None of them walked. None of them arrived with a canvas satchel over one shoulder and dried blood under their fingernails from a field dressing they had applied to themselves somewhere along the northern road. The gate guard had looked at her for a long moment, and then at his ledger, and then back at her. "Name," he said. "Maren of the Heswick borderlands," she said. He found it. He stared at it. He looked up again. "It says here you're the tribute from the Heswick Compact. It says you're an Omega." "It does," she said. "You walked 31 miles. I counted 34, she said, and walked past him into the compound. The Blackfold compound was the administrative seat of the Alpha King's southern territories, not the palace proper. Theron kept his court at Varenhall, 2 days north, and visited Blackfold the way a man visits a property he has not yet decided to sell, infrequently and without sentiment. The compound ran on a hierarchy that functioned like a mill wheel. The people at the top ground the people below them into flour, and nobody questioned whether there was a better arrangement because the wheel had been turning since before anyone's grandfather was born. Maren entered that wheel at the very bottom, Tribute Omega, from a border compact that had defaulted on its territorial tax 3 seasons running. The compact owed the crown in blood, if not in coin, and Maren was the blood. She was given a room that had been a storage closet and still smelled like it, dried herbs, old rope, and something rodent adjacent that she chose not to investigate. The room held a pallet, a 3-legged stool, and a window the size of a man's hand that looked out onto a drainage channel. She set her satchel down, sat on the pallet, and took stock. She was 23 years old. She was 5 feet and 4 inches of borderland-built stillness. She had dark hair cut short on the sides because long hair caught in machinery, and she had grown up near the mill. She had hands that knew 15 kinds of work and a working knowledge of medicinal plants that covered 240 miles of terrain. She had a sealed letter from the Heswick Compact's physician, which she did not open because she already knew what it said. She also had something no one here knew about yet. She tucked the letter into the lining of her satchel, beneath the false bottom she had sewn herself from a doubled piece of oilcloth, and began the business of surviving. The compound's head of household was a woman named Cressida, broad and deliberate, with the kind of face that had decided things once and not revisited them since. Cressida assigned Maren to the infirmary work because the previous infirmary assistant had left without notice, and the compound's physician, old Fenwick, was struggling with his eyesight and needed someone who could read his handwriting. "Can you read?" Cressida asked, not looking up from her ledger. "Yes," Maren said. "Can you write?" "Better than whoever made these entries," Maren said. and pointed at a column in the open ledger where someone had transposed two figures and thrown the whole monthly count off by 83 grams of dried willow bark. The silence after that was brief and absolute. "Infirmary," Cressida said. "Dawn's start. Don't be late and don't be loud." Marin was at the infirmary door before dawn, which meant she was there when old Fenwick arrived and found someone had already swept the floor, restocked the dressing jars, and correctly labeled the 3 medicine drawers he had been mislabeling for what appeared, based on the residue, to be the better part of a decade. He stood in the doorway for a moment, blinking through his thick-lensed spectacles at the neatly rearranged shelves, and then he looked at Marin. "You the new girl," he said. "Marin," she said, "you know what you've done to my system." "I've corrected it," she said. He thought about that for a long time. Then he came inside and sat down at his desk and did not argue. That was the first morning. The wheel turned, and somewhere 2 days north, the Alpha King had no idea any of it was happening. Theron arrived at Blackfold on the 41st day of Marin's tenure there, and she learned of his arrival the way she learned most things in that compound, from old Fenwick, who learned it from the gate log, which he reviewed each morning because it told him how many men had come in who might later arrive at the infirmary door bleeding. "The King's party, 40 riders and a supply column. He's doing a territorial review." Fenwick said it without looking up from the compound he was grinding. "Stay out of the main hall during meals. He doesn't like seeing tribute staff at the table." Marin noted this. She stayed out of the main hall during meals. She stayed out of it during the first 3 days of Theron's visit. In fact, catching her meals from the kitchen pass-through and eating on the steps of the infirmary, with her back to the drainage channel and a book of botanical records open across her knees. She was there, on the morning of the 4th day, when Boots stopped in front of her. Heavy boots, worn at the outer heel, which meant a man who stood with his weight shifted right, a habit of guarding something on his left side. She catalogued this without looking up. "You're blocking the path," said a voice that moved through the flagstones like a current. Marin looked up. Theron was taller than she had pictured from description, and the descriptions had not been modest. Wide through the jaw, dark through the eyes, still in the particular way of men who have learned that movement costs them nothing, but other people's attention costs them power. He looked at her, the way he looked at the drainage channel, without judgment and without interest. Property assessments didn't require interest. "I'm sitting on the steps," she said. "The path is beside them." A pause. Nobody around them spoke. "Your name," he said. "Marin. Marin." He repeated it the way one repeats an unfamiliar word in a foreign language, testing its weight. "Heswick tribute. Yes. You're the one who reorganized Fenwick's infirmary." It was not a question. "His system was losing inventory," she said. 3 grams of error per week, compounds to significant waste in a year. He looked at her for another moment, not with warmth, with the flat, measuring attention of a man who has found an anomaly in a ledger and has not yet decided if it represents a problem or an opportunity. Then he walked past her into the compound and did not look back. Marin returned to her book. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. She noticed this the way one notices the absence of an expected sound. She filed it away and turned the page. That was how it began, not with fire, not with revelation, with a man who walked past and a woman who did not move, and a silence that neither of them named. The first cruelty came from a man named Aldrich. He was Theron's compound steward, 6 feet of pressed authority, in a wool coat that had never seen weather, and he had been running Blackfold's tribute arrangements for 9 years, without anyone significantly questioning the process. He was not vicious in the way of men who enjoy pain. He was vicious in the way of men who enjoy order, and who have learned that pain is an efficient tool for maintaining it. On the 6th day of Theron's visit, Aldrich came to the infirmary and stood in the doorway, and looked at the reorganized shelves, and looked at Marin, and smiled the way a man smiles when he has already made a decision and is only performing consultation. "The tribute accommodations have been reviewed," he said. "Given the compound's current census, your room is required for visiting staff. You'll move to the common hall." The common hall was where the livestock handlers slept. It smelled correspondingly. It also had no lock. Marin knew this because she had treated 2 of the livestock handlers for a skin condition contracted from a shared basin, and she had noted the hall's layout in the practical way she noted all layouts. "I'll need a corner section with a curtain," she said. "The infirmary runs at night sometimes. I need to rise without disturbing others." Aldrich's smile did not change. "You'll take what's assigned. Then assign me a corner section. You're a tribute Omega from a defaulted compact." He said it carefully, the way one says a thing for the record. "You take what's given." Marin looked at him for 3 full seconds. "I understand my status," she said. "I'm requesting a curtain. It costs you nothing, and it prevents me from waking 12 men at 2 in the morning when Fenwick needs a fever compress." Aldrich left without granting it, and without denying it, which meant he had gone to think about whether the inconvenience of 12 woken men outweighed the satisfaction of the denial. He came back 2 hours later with a curtain rod and a length of brown canvas. He handed them to Marin without a word and left. She hung the curtain herself. Fenwick watched her do it from the doorway of the infirmary. "You know he'll find something else," he said. "He always does," she said. She climbed down from the stool she had used as a step. She folded the extra canvas neatly. "How long have you been here, Fenwick?" 31 years. "Then you've survived 31 years of him finding something else." The old physician's mouth moved in what was not quite a smile. "You're different from the others," he said. "The other tributes." "I know," she said. She did not say it with pride. She said it the way one states the weather. Fenwick was the first one to notice. He noticed on the 19th day of her time at Blackfold, when she was compounding a tincture for a guardsman's infected hand, and her posture shifted in the particular way that posture shifts when a body is negotiating with a new internal arrangement. He said nothing that day. He watched the next 7 days, the way a man watches a weather system he has seen before and knows the name of. On the morning of the 27th day, he set a small clay cup of ginger tea on the bench beside her, without comment, and went back to his desk. Marin looked at the tea. She looked at Fenwick's back. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Tell me if you need anything else." That was all. No questions about whose, no questions about when, no questions about what she planned, or what she feared, or what would happen when it became visible enough for others to see what he already saw. Old Fenwick had been a physician for 31 years, and in those 31 years he had learned that most of the important things could be addressed with small actions and no unnecessary speech. He brewed the ginger tea every morning after that. He adjusted her work schedule without mentioning why, keeping her off the tasks that required sustained bending or cold water. He relabeled 3 of the higher shelves so she could reach them with less strain. He did all of this without a word about it to anyone. The sealed letter in Marin's satchel, beneath the oilcloth false bottom, said what Fenwick already suspected. It had been written by the Heswick Compact's physician 4 months before she left, and it said that the child was not and had never been, and could not biologically be, the child of any man in Varenthold's court, because Marin had been in Heswick 4 months ago and had not yet left. It named the father, it named the circumstances, it named the date. Marin had carried it all 34 miles of the northern road without opening it, because she already knew every word of it, because she had watched it be written, because the Heswick physician was a woman named Sarah, who had delivered Marin into the world 23 years earlier, and who had pressed the sealed letter into Marin's hand at the gate and said, "If they ever need proof, this is the proof." If they ever need proof, Maren had thought about that on the road. She thought about it each morning when Fenwick set the tea down without comment. She had not yet decided when they would need it. She was not in a hurry. Patience was a borderland skill. You learned it in places where the winter lasted longer than the food. Aldrich's second effort came on the 44th day, and it was more direct than the curtain. Theron had extended his territorial review, which nobody in the compound had expected, and the presence of the king's party for a 6th week had pressurized every social arrangement Blackfold contained. People who had been tolerable to each other grew edges. Aldrich, denied the satisfaction of the curtain, had been refining his next approach for some time. He came to the infirmary in the evening, with 2 of the king's visiting pack officers flanking him, men with the particular flat attention of people who have been told to witness something. "There has been a report," Aldrich said, "of a tribute Omega accessing restricted ledger records." He looked at Maren with the expression of a man who has already written the verdict. The accounting wing. 2 entries in the monthly territorial supply record were corrected. By hand, in a script that has been identified, Maren set down the pestle she was holding. "Cressida asked me to verify the supply column," she said. "She noticed the error and couldn't identify the source. I found it. Cressida denies asking you to enter the accounting wing." The room went quiet. Fenwick did not look up from his desk. The 2 officers watched the middle distance with careful neutrality. Maren looked at Aldrich and understood exactly what was happening. Cressida had been pressured and had chosen the easier path. That was not a surprise. "I understand," Maren said. "What's the consequence?" Aldrich had expected more resistance. The brevity disrupted his prepared speech. He reset. 7 days of suspended rations. You'll eat what remains after the common hall has been served. "Fine," Maren said. She picked up the pestle again. "Can I finish this compound first, or do you need me to stop now?" Aldrich left. The 2 officers filed out behind him. Fenwick waited until the footsteps faded. "He'll report this to the king," Fenwick said. "I know," Maren said. "Let him." She ground the compound. Her hands were steady. Her stomach hurt in the way it had been hurting for 11 mornings. A dull, insistent pressure that had nothing to do with Aldrich, and nothing to do with Theron, and everything to do with the sealed letter beneath the oilcloth at the bottom of her satchel. She breathed through it. She finished the compound. She labeled the jar in her clean, regular script, and she set it on the shelf with the others, and she did not allow herself to think yet about what came after the 7 days. What came after the 7 days was Theron. He came to the infirmary on the morning of the 51st day, alone, which was unusual enough that old Fenwick straightened in his chair and then seemed to decide against whatever he had been about to say, and became very absorbed in a text he was not actually reading. Theron stood in the doorway for a moment, filling it in the physical way of a man accustomed to filling spaces, and then he came inside and looked at the shelves, and looked at the current patient chart on the wall, and looked at Maren. "Aldrich's report," he said. "I read it." "I assumed you would," she said. "He said you were insolent." She waited. "Were you? I corrected a supply ledger error that was costing your compound 11 grams of cinchona bark per month, and had been doing so for approximately 14 months. She paused. "You've lost just under 600 grams. At current northern trade price, that's approximately 2 silver weights." He looked at her, the way he had looked at her on the infirmary steps, flat and measuring. "You kept count." "I keep count of most things," she said. The silence was brief and very still. Fenwick's quill did not move. "The 7 days stand," Theron said. "You accessed restricted records without authorization." "Understood," she said. "Was there an error in Aldrich's report otherwise?" A pause long enough to mean something. "No," he said, and left. Fenwick exhaled slowly. "That," he said, "was interesting." "He's not stupid," Maren said. "He just hasn't been required to pay attention." She made a note in the supply record. She did not write down what she was thinking, which was that a man who was not stupid and who had just been made to pay attention was either an asset or a threat, and she had not yet determined which. On the 63rd day, the child became visible, not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself, simply in the way of a fact that had been present all along and had finally reached the threshold of the visible. Cressida saw it first, in the kitchen corridor on a morning when Marin was collecting the infirmary's breakfast order. Cressida's face did the thing faces do when they have been caught between two loyalties and have just realized the situation is beyond the easier of the two. She said nothing. She processed the order and handed over the basket and looked away. 3 other women saw it that week, in 3 different corridor-based moments, and each of them processed it in silence and looked away. The compound's social architecture depended on looking away. The information traveled faster than any of them. By the 67th day, it had reached Aldrich, who processed it not with the silence of the others, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been looking for the right lever and has finally found it. He went to the king. Marin was in the infirmary when she heard the footsteps. Not Theron's footsteps alone this time. Multiple. She set down the chart she was reading. Fenwick stood up slowly, which for Fenwick meant he had understood what was coming and was placing himself in a position to witness it clearly. Theron came in first, Aldrich behind him. 2 officers behind Aldrich. The room had been designed for 2 people at work. 6 people in it made it feel like a fist closing. Theron looked at her. He looked at what was now unambiguously visible. His face did not change in any way she could name. When? He said. Not a question, exactly. A demand for a number. Approximately 4 months along, she said. Whose? Again, not a question. A demand. And here was the thing she had been carrying for 67 days, alongside the sealed letter beneath the oilcloth. She looked at him. She looked at Aldrich. She looked at the 2 officers. She thought about Sarah at the Heswick gate, pressing the sealed letter into her hand, saying if they ever need proof. She looked back at Theron. You never asked, she said. I am asking now. No, she said. You're telling now. There's a difference. The silence after that could have been measured in weight. Theron stood absolutely still. Aldrich had been prepared for several things, and this particular response was not among them. The 2 officers had adopted the practiced vacancy of men who have been asked to witness events they intend to remember precisely and discuss never. Old Fenwick, at his desk in the corner, had both hands flat on the wood and was looking at Marin the way you look at a structure you have been watching brace itself for a long time and are now watching hold. You will answer, Theron said. His voice was low. It came through the floor. I will answer when I choose to, Marin said. Right now, I am informing you that the question has existed for 67 days, and this is the first time anyone in this compound has addressed it directly, including you. She set the chart she had been holding down on the bench, carefully, precisely. The child is not yours, she said. I was 4 months into the Borderlands posting before I was sent here. You can verify the dates with the Heswick Compact's records. I assume you have access to them. Then whose? Aldrich said. He said it with the triumphant edge of a man who has found his lever and intends to use it. A man in the Borderlands who is no longer living, she said. He died 6 weeks before I left. That was also in the letter. She had not planned to use the letter today. She had planned, in the broad sense, to use it at a moment when the compound was full of witnesses and the weight of what it contained could land where it would do the most good. But the moment had arrived with its own logic, and she had learned on the borderland roads that a traveler who waits for the perfect conditions dies waiting. She reached into the neck of her work tunic and withdrew the letter, which she had moved from the satchel to a flat pocket sewn inside the tunic lining on the 31st day. when she had decided that waiting was fine, but being caught unprepared was not. She held it out to Theron. "This was written by the Heswick Compact's physician," she said. "It names the father, the date of conception, and the date of death. It was sealed by the Compact's territorial notary." Theron took the letter. He did not open it immediately. He looked at it. He looked at her, and for the first time since the morning she had walked past the gate guard, something shifted in the way he held himself. Not much. Not softness. A weight moving to a different position. "You've had this since you arrived," he said. "Yes," she said. "And you said nothing. No one asked," she said. "That is the third time you have said that. It will keep being true until it stops being true." He opened the letter in the main hall. Not the infirmary, not his private chambers. The main hall, with 16 of the compound's senior staff present for the morning briefing, which he had called without announcing the reason. Marin had not been summoned to it. She was in the infirmary, restocking the dressing jars. She heard about what happened in the hall from Fenwick, who heard it from Cressida, who had been present, and who had, for the first time in Marin's experience of her, looked as though the decision she had made 9 days earlier had cost her something she had not expected to miss. Theron had read the letter aloud, all of it, the name, the date, the compact notary's seal, the physician's testimony. He had read it in a voice that Cressida described as very quiet and very even, the kind of quiet that is not calm, but is controlled, and is all the more effective for the difference. When he finished reading, he had folded the letter along its original creases and set it on the table. Then he had looked at Aldrich. "You reported a tribute Omega for accessing restricted records," he said. "In the same period, you failed to report that the same Omega was managing a pregnancy that your compound's household arrangements had made no accommodation for." Aldrich had said something about the restricted records being the relevant concern. "The relevant concern," Theron said, "is that a woman in my compound's care has been sleeping in a livestock hall for 30 days without a physician's supervision." Fenwick, Marin was fairly sure, would have disagreed with this on factual grounds, but Fenwick had not been in the hall, and so could not offer the correction. What happened next was not immediate. It took 3 days. 3 days in which the compound's atmosphere changed the way the air changes before a significant storm, pressure, building in all the spaces between people, nobody quite looking at anyone else directly. On the 4th day, Aldrich was relieved of his post as compound steward and reassigned to the Northern Territorial Audit Commission, which was a technical promotion and a practical exile, and everyone understood what it was. On that same morning, Marin was given a room with a window that looked onto the courtyard and a fireplace that worked, and a lock on the door. She stood in the room for a moment after Cressida showed her to it, looking at the fireplace and the window and the lock, and she understood that these things were not an apology. Apologies were words. These were arrangements. She could work with arrangements. Theron came to the infirmary on the 78th day without Aldrich and without officers and without any official stated purpose. Old Fenwick was there, but he found an errand in the supply closet that kept him occupied and quiet with remarkable efficiency. Theron stood at the bench where Marin was working, measuring out a precise 3.4 grams of dried valerian root for the guardsman whose hand infection had progressed to a secondary nerve complaint. She completed the measure before she acknowledged him. "The letter has been archived with the compact records," he said. "Thank you," she said. "I'm arranging a formal review of the tribute compact terms," he said. "Specifically, the provision that allowed the borderland posts to send any person as a defaulted tax substitute." She set down the measuring scale. She looked at him. "That provision has existed for 60 years, she said. "I know," he said. "It's wrong." She did not say anything immediately. She weighed the silence the way she weighed dried herbs, carefully and without haste. "That's a significant thing to change," she said. I know that too, he said. What happens to me during the review? He looked at her. Something in the measurement quality of his gaze had changed. Still flat, still dark, but attentive in a different way, the way you attend to something that has ceased to be an anomaly and has become a reference point. That's your decision, he said, not mine. It should have been my decision from the start, she said. Yes, he said. It was the flattest syllable she had ever heard him produce, and it carried more weight than most of his longer speeches. Stay, he said, or go. Either one, on your terms. She looked at the Valerian route. She thought about 34 miles of northern road, and a gate guard, and a storage closet, and a curtain rod, and the ginger tea every morning, and Sarah's sealed letter, and 14 stars through the smoke. I'll decide, she said, when I'm ready. He nodded once. He left. She finished the measure. Her hands were, as they had always been, entirely steady. The decision took 11 more days. In those 11 days she watched him. She was good at watching. Borderland skill. Again, the kind you develop when the people around you are not always safe, and you have learned to read the small signals before the large ones arrive. She watched him in the compound yard, talking to the gate guard, with the same attention he gave the senior officers. She watched him at the morning briefings, when Aldrich's replacement, a younger woman named Brine, presented supply figures with the nervousness of someone who had heard about her predecessor. She watched him correct Bryn twice, both times briefly and without theatre, and she watched Bryn's shoulders come down a full inch after the second correction. She watched him come to the infirmary doorway on the 82nd day and stand there looking at the arrangement of Fenwick's shelves without coming inside, as if deciding something. She watched him notice her watching him, noticing the shelves, and neither of them spoke, and he left. She watched old Fenwick watch this exchange, and then return to his text, with the expression of a man who has understood the ending of a long story and is too experienced to remark on it. On the 89th day, she went to Theron's quarters. Not at night. At mid-morning, when the compound was at full activity and the corridor was populated, and the visit was, therefore, visible and unambiguous. She knocked. He opened the door. She said, "I'm staying." These are my terms. She had written them on a single sheet of paper. 6 items. Infirmary authority, her own, not subordinate to the household steward. Recognition of the child's documented parentage in the compact records, permanent and unambiguous. Access to the territorial ledgers as a working consultant, not as a tribute function. A formal review of the Borderland Compact provisions to be completed before the end of the season. A room with a working fireplace for the duration of her stay. And the 6th thing, which she had written last and had almost not written at all, and which read, "Honesty in all things, from this point forward, mutual, without exception." He read all 6. He read them twice. He looked at her. "These are terms," he said. "You said I could dictate them," she said. "I did," he said. And then, with no further performance, he signed the bottom of the page with the compact seal from his desk, and he handed it back to her, and he looked at her for a long moment, with something that was not yet warmth, but was the structure upon which warmth is built, and he said, "Welcome to Blackfold, Marin of Heswick." "I've been here 89 days, she said. "I know," he said. "I should have said it sooner." The first snow came 6 days later, overnight, the way the first snow always came in the Southern Territories, without announcement and without mercy. 4 inches of it on the courtyard stones, and a cold that turned breath into smoke at the infirmary door. Marin stood in the doorway with a mug of ginger tea, her own brewing, and looked at the courtyard, and the white weight on the gate roof, and the single set of boot tracks crossing from the king's quarters to the stables. Theron was up before dawn, same as always. The tracks were deep in the right heel, light in the left. She had been reading that pattern for 89 days, and she knew it as well as she knew the Valerian root measure, or the botanical index, or the 14 stars through the autumn smoke. The child moved that morning for the first time that she could feel, with certainty, rather than suspect. A small thing, a turning. She stood in the infirmary doorway with the tea and the snow and the boot tracks and the moving child, and she thought of Sarah at the Heswick gate, saying if they ever need proof, and she thought that proof was not the same as truth, and truth was not the same as justice, and justice was not the same as home. But standing in the doorway in the first snow with the ginger tea, and the child turning, and the boot tracks crossing the courtyard toward the stables, she thought that possibly, for the first time in a long time, all four of those things were occupying the same territory. She was nothing to him, he had said. That was what the courier had delivered, 4 words on a folded parchment, 4 months later, when the child was too visible, and the compound's social architecture had cracked under the weight of it, and he had sent her out with 2 pine poles and a moth-eaten blanket, and a decree that fit in 4 words. Except that morning had not come yet. In the story's true order, that morning was still ahead of her, still unreached, still a future she did not yet know she would survive and then return from. And when it did come, it came because she had underestimated not Theron, who turned out to be exactly who she had read him to be, but the thing that moved in the compound between them after the signed page, the thing that had no name in the territorial records and could not be measured in grams or silver weights, the thing that both of them had been careful, and then less careful, and then not careful at all about. But that is the part of the story where the machine of another person's fear grinds down what has been built, and it is also the part where built things, properly built, do not stay ground. She finished her tea. She went inside. She had work to do, and the work, as always, would be where she was when the next thing arrived. Marin heard the second decree on a morning that smelled like ice and old smoke, the 61st day after the signed page, 4 months and some number of hours after she had walked through the black-fold gate, with blood under her fingernails, and a canvas satchel, and a false-bottomed pocket sewn from oilcloth. The courier was young and did not want to be there. He held the parchment with both hands and did not meet her eyes, and read it from the paper rather than from memory, which meant he had been handed it and told to deliver it, and had not been told anything else. It cited a provision of the Royal Compact Charter. Tribute Omegas who carried a child of uncertain documentation were subject to immediate removal from royal compounds pending formal review. The review, the parchment said, could take up to 6 months. Fenwick, who was at his desk and had heard every word, did not speak. He set down his quill. He folded his hands. The courier left. Marin looked at the parchment, which she was now holding, and she recognized Theron's seal at the bottom, and she recognized that the seal was real, and the parchment was real, and the provision cited was real, because she had read the Compact Charter herself, access to the territorial ledgers having been one of her 6 terms. She also recognized that Theron had signed it. She had been watching him for 150 days, and she did not believe he had signed it willingly, which meant someone had placed it in front of him in a context she had not yet seen, and she had learned on the borderland roads that a traveler who makes decisions without seeing the full terrain dies early. She did not cry. She put the parchment in her satchel. She packed the satchel, which took 11 minutes. She said goodbye to Fenwick, who stood up and took her hands in both of his and said nothing, which was the most expensive thing he had said to her in 150 days. She walked out the infirmary door and across the courtyard, in the ice and old smoke, and she was through the east gate and onto the northern road for 43 steps before the boot tracks caught up with her. Theron did not say her name. He came up beside her and fell into step, and they walked together for 4 steps in silence, and then he said, "I didn't know what was in it." "I know," she said. "I should have read it before I sealed it." "Yes," she said. "Bryn brought it with the morning briefing documents," he said. "She didn't know either." I know that too, Marin said. They walked. The road was frozen. Her breath came out white. She was counting steps the way she had counted stars. Come back, he said. No, she said. Not like that. Tell me what you need, he said. The road was empty in both directions. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She turned and looked at him, in the morning ice, and the white breath, and the nowhere light of a sky that had not yet decided on its weather. A public review, she said. In the main hall. All senior staff. You read the compact provision aloud, and you read the physician's letter aloud, and you explain, in terms that go into the compound record, that the provision was applied incorrectly because I am not a tribute omega of uncertain documentation. I am a formally documented compact consultant with a signed agreement that predates the removal order. She paused. And then, she said, you burn the removal order in front of all of them. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that she did not name. When? He said. Today, she said. Now. He turned back toward the gate. She followed him, 3 steps behind, which was the standard spacing for the road, and then 2 steps, and then 1, and then they were walking side by side through the east gate, and across the courtyard, and into the main hall, and behind them, the gate guard was already moving to gather the senior staff. The main hall held 22 people by the time Theron stood at the head of the long table. Bryn was there, pale and attentive. Cressida was there, with the look of a woman who has been present for several significant mornings and has stopped being surprised by them. 8 of the king's officers sat along the left side of the table. Senior household staff filled the rest. Fenwick had been sent for and stood near the door, his thick spectacles catching the torchlight. The hall smelled like pine resin and wool and the particular dry cold of a space heated by bodies rather than fire. Marin stood to the right of the table, not at the head, not seated, standing, with her satchel over her shoulder and her hands loose at her sides. Theron opened the compact charter. He found the provision. He read it aloud, all of it, every clause, in the low, even voice that moved through the floor. Then he set the charter aside. He picked up Sarah's letter, the physician's letter, the letter Marin had carried 34 miles and sewn into a tunic lining and held for 151 days. He read it aloud, all of it, the name, the date, the notary's seal, the circumstances. His voice did not change during any of it. When he finished, he set the letter down and he looked at the room. The removal order was applied to an incorrect provision, he said. Marin of Heswick is a formally documented compact consultant operating under a signed territorial agreement. The removal order is void. He took the removal order from inside his coat. Someone had retrieved it from Marin's satchel while she stood in the courtyard. She had felt the slight displacement of the satchel's weight and had not commented on it. Theron held the order over the oil lamp at the center of the table. He held it there until it caught. He held it further until it was ash. He set the ash on the table. He looked at the room again. This will be recorded, he said. The room was silent. Not the silence of held breath, the silence of a wheel that has stopped turning. Marin looked at Cressida. Cressida looked at the table. She looked at Fenwick. He was looking at her with the expression she had first seen when he found his infirmary reorganized on the second morning, a thing that had stopped being surprised and started being satisfied. Any questions about the record, Theron said, should be directed to Bryn. He looked at Marin. She looked back. He said nothing. She said nothing. The 22 people in the hall had become a single organism, holding very still. Then Marin set her satchel on the floor beside the table. She reached inside. She took out the valerian root compound she had been measuring when the courier had arrived that morning. She set it on the table. I wasn't finished with the guardsman's treatment, she said. And she picked up her satchel and walked out of the hall and back to the infirmary. The wheel did not start turning again. Something else began instead. The winter came in hard that year, the way winters came in the Southern Territories when they meant to stay. Marin worked through it. The infirmary was full in the cold months. Cold air, doing what cold air does to old injuries and borrowed bones. And Fenwick's eyesight had declined enough by mid-season that she was doing the majority of the fine work herself, the suturing, and the compound preparation, and the precise measurement of things that could not afford imprecision. Theron came by the infirmary most mornings, not always inside, sometimes just to the doorway, the way he had come on the 82nd day, standing in the frame and looking at the shelves, and at her, and at Fenwick, and then going on with whatever the morning required. Some mornings he came inside and sat on the three-legged stool Marin had kept from the storage closet room, and drank bad coffee from the infirmary pot, and read through the territorial correspondence while she worked. He did not explain these visits. She did not ask. They had a signed page, and a burned removal order, and 6 terms met, and a lot of morning cold between them, and that was a foundation, and on a foundation you build with small things before you try the large ones. The child was born in early spring, a daughter, healthy, loud, with the dark hair of the Heswick borderlands, and hands that were already, even at 11 hours old, very precisely gripping things. Marin named her Sarah, for reasons Fenwick understood without being told, and Theron learned from Marin directly, sitting in the chair beside the infirmary bed on the second morning, when she told him about the Heswick physician, and the gate, and the letter, and the 34 miles. "She gave you the proof," he said. "She gave me the option," Marin said. "There's a difference." He had the look of a man who was getting used to those distinctions. Bryn brought a supply of the good, soft wool from the household stores, without being asked. Cressida appeared at the infirmary door on the 3rd morning with a basin of warm water and a practical, wordless competence that meant she had done this before and was doing it now, without requiring acknowledgement for either fact. The compound attended to what was needed. It was not warmth in the way of declarations. It was warmth in the way of things arranged correctly, and Marin, who had been born in the borderlands and had walked 34 miles with blood under her fingernails, understood that kind of warmth better than any other. He thought he had dismissed her. He thought the 4 words, and the courier, and the parchment, had ended something. He had no idea what he had carried into his own house, which was not a burden, and not a problem, and not an anomaly in a ledger, but a woman who had already decided what she was worth, and simply waited for everyone else to catch up with the number. The infirmary smelled like pine resin, and ginger, and warm wool on the morning Theron sat in the chair beside the bed, and Marin set the daughter in his arms for the first time, without ceremony or speech, and he held her with the careful stillness of a man who has learned that the most important things do not tolerate carelessness. And outside the window the first birds were beginning in the courtyard trees, and the wheel did not turn, and the foundation held, and Marin drank her tea, and watched him understand, finally and completely, everything he had not asked. If you've made it to the end of this story, you know what Marin proved. She proved that the question never asked can carry more power than any answer given. She proved that competence brought quietly into a hostile room is a kind of siege, and patience is the only supply chain it requires. Stories like this one land differently when you find them, because you were looking for something true, and if this one found you, it probably means something. If it did, hit like so other people can find it too. Share it with anyone who understands what it costs to know your own worth in a room that refuses to see it. Subscribe and turn the notifications on so you're here when the next story begins. And leave a comment with the thing you keep thinking about. When Marin handed Theron the terms and he signed them without argument, was that the moment he changed, or had the change already happened somewhere earlier, quietly, without either of them naming it? The ginger tea is still on the bench, the window still looks onto the courtyard, and Sarah, the daughter, is already gripping things very precisely, the way her mother always did, which meant the compound had its hands full and did not notice, at first, the arrival of the northern delegation. They came in the third week of spring, 11 riders with the pale banners of the Thornwick Territorial Authority, the body that administered the 6 Northern Compacts and reported directly to the High Council rather than to Theron's court. Merrin had read about the Thornwick Authority in the territorial ledgers. She had read about it the way she read everything in the ledgers, carefully, without announcing what she had found, filing the significant parts in the same internal architecture where she kept the ginger tea schedule and the Valerian root measure and the 14 stars. The Thornwick Authority had jurisdiction over compact tribute arrangements. It had the power to review, revise, or retroactively challenge compact agreements. It had, in particular, the power to challenge agreements signed under irregular circumstances, which was language broad enough to cover, among other things, a compact consultants agreement signed by a king who had been awake for 19 hours and presented with a single sheet of paper by a woman standing in his doorway at mid-morning with terms written in her own hand. Merrin knew all of this. She had known it since the 43rd day of reading the ledgers, which was the day she found the Thornwick provision buried in a supplementary index at the back of the 3rd territorial volume. She had made a note of it and filed it, and had not thought it would be relevant, and then had thought it might become relevant, and had waited to see. She was still waiting when the 11 riders came through the Blackfold gate, with the pale banners snapping in the cold spring wind, and the head of the delegation, a man named Sorvin, thin as a ledger spine with eyes that had been doing arithmetic since before he could walk, presented his authority documents to the gate guard and asked to see the king. Theron told her that evening. He came to the infirmary door in the late light, stood in the frame as he often did, and said, "The Thornwick delegation is here to review your agreement." He said it flatly, the way he said most things, but she had been reading him for 190 days, and she heard what was underneath the flatness. "I know who they are," she said. "They have the authority," he said. "Yes," she said. "What's the basis of the challenge?" "They're calling it an irregular agreement, a tribute Omega negotiating terms directly with a sitting king without compact intermediary." Merrin looked at the tincture she was preparing. She looked at the measure on the scale. "That's technically accurate," she said. "Yes," he said, "but so is the signed page." "So is the signed page," he agreed. They were quiet for a moment. Fenwick was in the supply closet again, an errand that had been requiring more of his attention recently. "What do they want?" she said. Not a question. He understood she meant, what is the real agenda under the procedural one? "To demonstrate that compact terms can be revised downward," he said. "There are 6 Northern Compacts that have been pushing for renegotiation. If they can argue your agreement is irregular, it establishes a framework for challenging any compact agreement signed under unusual circumstances." She set the measure down. "So I'm not the point," she said. "You're the precedent," he said. She had thought, when she was on the northern road with her satchel and the morning ice, that the danger was behind her. She saw now that danger did not work by direction. It worked by patience, the same way she did, and it had simply been waiting for a better season. Sorvin requested a formal hearing the next morning. He requested it in writing, delivered by one of his riders to Theron's quarters, and he requested that all parties to the irregular agreement be present. All parties meant Theron and Merrin. It also, in a clause at the bottom of the written request that Merrin read when Theron showed her the document at breakfast, meant any witnesses to the original signing. There had been one witness. The corridor outside Theron's quarters on the morning Merrin had knocked on his door with her single sheet of paper had been populated, because she had chosen mid-morning deliberately, and the person who had been most visibly present and most demonstrably observant was Bryn, who had been carrying the morning's briefing documents and had stopped walking when she saw Marin knock, and had been standing 12 feet away when the door opened and Marin had handed over the sheet. Brine, when Marin found her before the noon meal, was pale and precise and said, "I saw it. I saw all of it. Tell me what you need me to say." "The truth," Marin said. "Exactly what you saw, exactly in the order you saw it." Brine nodded. She was steadier than she looked. "He read it twice," Brine said, "before he signed. He stood in the doorway, and he read it twice." "I know," Marin said. "Will that matter?" "It might," Marin said. "It shows deliberation." She paused. "It shows he knew what he was signing." The hearing was held in the main hall, on the third day of the delegation's visit. The same hall, the same table. The same torchlight on Fenwick's spectacles, because Fenwick had been included in the witness list and sat at the far end of the table with his hands folded and his expression set to the particular blankness of a man who has been a physician for 31 years and has sat at worse tables for worse hearings. Sorvin opened the proceeding with a precision that Marin respected professionally, even while noting that it was directed at her removal. He laid out the Thornwick Authority's jurisdiction. He laid out the definition of an irregular agreement. He cited 3 previous cases where compact agreements had been reviewed and revised. He did all of this in 14 minutes, and in those 14 minutes Marin sat beside the table with Sarah asleep in a cloth carrier against her chest, because she had decided that morning to bring the child, and had not explained this to anyone, and the presence of a sleeping infant in a cloth carrier against the chest of the woman whose agreement was being challenged was not something Sorvin's prepared remarks had accounted for. It was not a manipulation, it was a practical decision, because Sarah needed to be fed at regular intervals, and the hearing was scheduled for 2 hours, and Marin was not leaving her daughter in the infirmary for 2 hours. The fact that it was also the most direct possible embodiment of every documented fact in the physician's letter was a coincidence that Marin did not point out, and did not need to. Sorvin made his case. Theron listened without moving. Then Marin spoke. She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She had the signed page, which she laid on the table. She had the compact charter, open to the provision that governed consultant agreements, which were not subject to the same intermediary requirement as tribute agreements, because consultants were not tribute. She had, and this was the part she had spent the 43rd day through the 188th day, quietly assembling, a secondary document. A record of 17 supply corrections, 3 compound reformulations, 4 inventory recoveries, and 1 full audit of the infirmary pharmaceutical stock that she had completed in the previous 5 months, all in her handwriting, all dated, all cross-referenced with the compound's official records in Brine's handwriting. The value of the recovered supply inventory alone, in current northern trade prices, was 41 silver weights and some number of grams. She set the document on the table beside the signed page. "A consultant provides documented value to the compact," she said. "I have provided documented value. The agreement reflects that. It was signed deliberately by a party with authority to sign it, after 2 readings." She looked at Sorvin. "If the Thornwick Authority's concern is that irregular agreements can be challenged on procedural grounds, I would suggest that this agreement is the least vulnerable target available. It is thoroughly documented, economically demonstrated, and signed by a king." She paused. "Find a softer precedent." Sorvin looked at the documents. He looked at her. He looked at the sleeping child. He said, "The authority will need time to review the secondary documentation." "Take it," Marin said. "I'm not going anywhere." The review took 4 days. In those 4 days, the compound ran as it always ran, with Marin in the infirmary, and Fenwick at his desk, and Bryn managing the briefings, and Theron conducting the territorial business that did not pause for Thornwick delegations or anyone else. On the 2nd day, Sorvin came to the infirmary, alone, without his riders, at an hour when Fenwick was out, and Marin was feeding Sarah in the chair by the window that looked onto the courtyard. He stood in the doorway. She looked at him over the child's head. "You knew about the Thornwick provision," he said. "Before the review was filed." "Yes," she said. "How long?" "Since the 43rd day of my ledger access," she said. "You prepared for this." "I prepare for most things," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the courtyard. He had the look of a man recalculating. "The 17 supply corrections," he said. "Were those part of the preparation?" "No," she said. "Those were part of the work." He nodded once, slowly. "The secondary documentation is very thorough," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and she saw that he was not, at the root of it, a bad man. He was a man with a mandate and an agenda above the mandate, and he was now in the position of having the agenda in one hand and the documentation in the other, and the documentation was heavier. "The authorities' review will likely conclude that the agreement is procedurally sound," he said. "That conclusion will be recorded." "I know," she said again. He left. The courtyard was bright in the thin spring light, and a pair of starlings were doing something complicated in the eaves above the stable door, and Sarah had fallen asleep again, against Marin's arm, with the absolute trust of something that has never yet been required to distrust anything. And Marin sat in the chair, and held her, and looked at the courtyard, and thought that this, too, was a kind of proof. Not the kind Sarah the physician had meant when she pressed the letter into her hand. A different kind. The kind you do not write down because it does not fit in a document. The kind that lives in a room, and a window, and a weight in your arms on a spring morning. The delegation left on the 5th day. Sorvin's written conclusion was 3 pages, and concluded that the Blackfold Compact Consultant Agreement was procedurally and substantively sound, and not subject to revision under the Thornwick Authority's jurisdiction. It was filed with the Compound Record, and a copy was sent to the High Council, and a copy was kept in Marin's satchel under the oilcloth false bottom beside the space where Sarah's original letter had once been, because the false bottom was now a general archive, and Marin saw no reason to waste a well-sewn pocket. Theron came to the infirmary that evening, and this time he came all the way inside and sat on the 3-legged stool and did not bring the territorial correspondence. He sat and looked at her working, and then he said, "You knew about the Thornwick provision for over 100 days." "Yes," she said. "You didn't tell me. You didn't ask," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's different," he said. "From the other times you said that." "Yes," she said. "How?" "Before. You didn't ask, because you didn't think to. This time, I didn't tell you, because I was waiting to see if I'd need it." She looked at him. "I didn't know, in the early months, whether you were the person I had read you to be. I had evidence. I didn't have certainty, so I kept the option. And now," he said. "Now the option is filed," she said, "and the evidence holds." He looked at the shelves. He looked at the closed door of the supply closet, behind which Fenwick was once again finding something to occupy him. He looked at Sarah, in the cloth carrier, on the hook by the window, asleep with her hands curled into small, deliberate fists. "I should have asked," he said, "whose child you carried, from the first moment." "Yes," she said. "I'm saying I understand why that matters." "I know you are," she said. "Do you believe me?" She looked at him for a long time. The infirmary was warm. The fire was low and good. The starlings were quiet in the eaves. "Yes," she said, "I believe you understand it. That's not the same as it not having happened." "No," he said, "it's not. But it's where you build from," she said, admitting what happened and what it cost, and staying in the room after. He stayed in the room. He stayed for another hour, on the 3-legged stool, while she finished the evening preparations and labeled the jars and checked the supply record, and, at the end, lifted Sarah from the cloth carrier, and held her in the practiced way of a woman who had been doing this for 6 weeks, and had learned the specific balance of a sleeping child, the way she had learned the specific balance of a measuring scale. He watched this. He did not look away. She held the child out to him, and he took her, with the same careful stillness he always had. And this time, Maren did not watch him understand. He had already understood. This time she turned back to the supply record and made the last notation of the day, and behind her she could hear the exact quality of silence that a man produces when he is holding something small and new, and is very careful not to breathe too hard. 3 weeks later, he asked her to move from the infirmary room to the quarters adjacent to his. He asked her in the morning, at the infirmary door, without preamble or decoration. "The infirmary room is too far from the main compound at night," he said. "If anything happens—" "The infirmary is 30 yards from the main hall," she said. "It's on the other side of the drainage channel," he said. "That channel has 14 inches of late spring runoff in it right now." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Is this a practical concern?" she said. "Or is it the other kind?" "Both," he said, with the flatness of a man who has decided to stop pretending the categories are separate. She thought about it for 3 days. She moved on the 4th. Not because the 30 yards and the drainage channel and the late spring runoff required it. Because she had watched him for 216 days, and she had read the small signals before the large ones, and the large ones had been coming in for some time, and she was a woman who prepared for most things, and she had decided she was done waiting on this particular thing. The quarters were warm. There was a fireplace that worked, and a window that looked onto the courtyard, and a lock on the door, the same provisions she had been given after the main hall reading, but larger, and with a connecting door to the adjacent room that she noted and did not remark on. Fenwick helped her carry the 3 things she could not carry herself, and when they set the last of them down, he put his hands on his knees and straightened slowly and looked around the room. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He went back to the infirmary. She arranged her things in the new room in the order that made sense for them, which was the practical order, not the decorative one, because she was who she was, and the room would reflect that. The sealed letters copy went in the new room's document box. The botanical index went on the shelf beside the window. The satchel went on the hook by the door. The false bottom, she decided, could finally be unsewn. There was nothing left that needed hiding. That was not the last difficult thing, because nothing is the last difficult thing. The Northern Compacts continued to push for renegotiation, and 2 of them succeeded, partially, in ways that required Maren's documented framework to be invoked as counterweight in 3 separate hearings over the following year. Aldrich sent a formal letter of grievance from his northern posting that was so precisely worded it was almost beautiful, and Bryn summarized it for Theron in 7 seconds flat, and filed it in the archive without waiting to be told. Cressida retired at the end of the summer, quietly and with complete dignity, and at her departure, Maren gave her the length of brown canvas from the curtain rod, folded neatly, without explanation, and Cressida took it, without asking for one, and that was the whole of the conversation, and it was sufficient. Fenwick's eyesight continued to decline, and by the following winter, Maren was doing all of the fine work herself, and Fenwick sat at his desk and read to Sarah, who was by then old enough to hold the books, and young enough to regard this as the highest possible use of an afternoon. The compound kept its rhythm. The wheel that had stopped turning in the main hall during the burning of the removal order had not started again. Something else had taken its place, something that did not grind, that moved without requiring someone below it to be made into flour. It was not a perfect system, no system built by people in a compound that smelled like pine resin and iron and wet wool in the cold months was going to be perfect. But it was a different system, and Maren had been part of its building, and the difference was documented. On the 2nd anniversary of her arrival at the Blackfold Gate, Marin stood in the infirmary doorway at dawn with a mug of ginger tea and looked at the courtyard. The boot tracks crossed the stones from the king's quarters to the stables, deep at the right heel, light at the left. Sarah was asleep in the room beside the fireplace, having refused, the previous evening, to go to sleep without first conducting a thorough audit of the shelf contents, which she achieved by pulling 7 things off it and examining each one, which was also exactly what Marin would have done. The compound was quiet. The birds were beginning in the eaves. She thought about the 14 stars and the moth-eaten blanket and the 4 words on the parchment, and she thought about the 34 miles and the gate guard and the false-bottomed satchel and old Fenwick's ginger tea and the morning she had walked to Theron's door with a single sheet of paper and 6 terms written in her own hand, and she thought that all of these things had happened and were in the record, literally and otherwise, and that the record did not require her grief, or her rage, or her explanation. It simply was. She was nothing to him, it had said, and the courier had walked away, and the gate had closed, and she had been carried out on 2 pine poles and a moth-eaten blanket, and she had counted the stars, and then she had walked back in, not because she had been called back, though she had been, not because the removal order had been burned, though it had, because the 6 terms were met, and the foundation held, and the work was here, and the people who needed the work were here, and Marin of Heswick did not abandon the work. She finished her tea. The boot tracks came back from the stables, and then Theron was crossing the courtyard in the early light, and he saw her in the doorway, and he stopped for a moment, the way he had stopped outside the infirmary on the 82nd day. Then he came across the courtyard and stood at the bottom of the steps. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early," she said. He looked at the mug. He looked at her. He said, "Is there more of that?" She went inside and poured another mug from the pot she had brewed for 2, because she had been doing this for 89 days before she moved to the quarters and had continued it after, and she handed it to him, and he took it and stood on the steps beside her and looked at the courtyard filling with morning. Nothing declared. Nothing performed. The courtyard and the tea and the early birds and the sound of Sarah beginning to wake in the room behind them, her small voice rising with the particular authority of a child who has opinions about mornings and is not shy about them. That was the shape of it. Not a crown, and not a decree, and not a courier on a frozen road. Just the ordinary morning, continuing, on terms that Marin had written herself. If you stayed for every word of this story, then you know what Marin proved. She proved that being dismissed is not the same as being defeated, and that the people who forget to ask the right questions end up answering for that silence eventually. Stories like this one find the people who need them, and if this one found you, that probably means something. Hit the like button so it can find a few more. Share it with someone who knows what it is to carry proof they were never asked to show. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you are here when the next story begins. And leave a comment. The moment Marin handed Theron the 6 terms and he signed without argument, was that the moment he changed, or had he already changed somewhere earlier, in a doorway, or a courtyard, or a morning with cold coffee and a 3-legged stool, without either of them giving it a name? The ginger tea is still on the bench, the satchel is on the hook by the door, the false bottom is unsewn, and there is nothing left inside it that needs hiding.